Have you ever walked into a room and felt the quiet hum of belonging, then realized somehow you were the only one who didn't fit? My name is Grace Porter, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the person standing just at the edge of every family photo, the voice that never quite rose above the laughter at the dinner table. If you know what it's like to feel invisible in a place that's supposed to be home, then maybe this story will sound a little like yours too. I grew up in the hills outside Asheville, North Carolina, in a house that was always full siblings, running down the halls, the radio on in the kitchen, my mother's voice echoing up the stairs. On paper, we looked like the perfect family birthdays, holidays, even ordinary Tuesdays always captured in smiling snapshots for the mantle. But in between the photographs, there were spaces, moments that slipped by unnoticed, and feelings I learned to tuck away. Maybe you know about those spaces too, the ones where you wonder if anyone truly sees you. There's a special kind of hope that lingers for people like us, the ones who give quietly and wait for someone to notice. I remember every time I picked up someone else's coat, refilled a water glass, swept the confetti after a party was done, small kindnesses I hoped would be returned with a look of thank you, maybe even an arm around my shoulders. Instead, I learned to fill my own silence with stories, to let my dreams echo in empty rooms, while the rest of the world spun on without me. That's the ache that comes from wanting so much to belong, and feeling like a guest in your own life. As I grew older, I convinced myself that this was just how families worked. Some people shine, some people support. I tried harder. I brought home trophies, picked up extra chores, planned surprises for everyone's birthdays, but my own. For a while, it almost felt like enough. Until one day it wasn't. Until the moment I realized that waiting quietly on the sidelines was only teaching everyone else to keep playing without me. That realization that ache became the start of a story I never expected to write. Tonight I want to invite you into that story. Not just to share my pain, but to open a door to healing. Over the next hour, you'll hear about old promises and quiet heartbreaks, about the day I finally saw the truth reflected back at me, not as a harsh spotlight, but as a soft, undeniable glow. You'll see how even the smallest acts of recognition, or the absence of them, can change the course of a life. You'll follow me from the loneliness of unreturned calls and forgotten birthdays, through moments of clarity, anger, and eventually freedom. But before we go further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt invisible in your own story? Have you ever wondered if the people who should love you most have simply forgotten how? If you have, you're not alone. I hope as we travel together through the memories that shaped me, you'll find your own quiet courage rekindled. Because every story worth telling has a turning point, a moment when the person no one noticed decides to finally see themselves. So let's begin together with a single question. What happens when the invisible thread that once tied you to your family finally snaps, and you have to decide whether to reach for it again or start weaving something new? This is the story of how I found my answer and why sometimes letting go is the bravest thing you'll ever do. Sometimes when I think about childhood, I remember it not as a series of big events, but as a quiet pattern, threads of sunlight through the trees, the hum of voices in the next room, laughter spilling down the hallway that always seemed to stop just before it reached my door. In our house outside Asheville, the days spun together in a gentle kind of chaos. My older brother Ethan building towers out of couch cushions, my little sister Olivia dancing barefoot in the kitchen, my parents busy with their work and their worries. I was somewhere in the middle, old enough to be helpful, young enough to still hope for someone to notice. I didn't have the loudest laugh or the wildest dreams. Instead, I learned to listen well, to tidy up the edges of everyone else's messes, to make myself useful in a way that rarely drew attention. It's funny how a whole childhood can pass in the spaces between other people's stories. I didn't realize, not at first, that being the quiet one in the family would follow me so closely. At every holiday, my mother's voice would echo through the house, "Ethan, help your father Olivia come set the table." My own name drifted in as an afterthought, sometimes just a gentle grace, "Can you?" trailing off before I could answer. If someone forgot a birthday or a piano recital, it was always mine. "Oh, honey, you know we're just so busy these days," Mom would say, smiling, as if that made up for the empty seats in the audience. I learned to swallow disappointment quietly to let it settle in the place where pride and longing meet. I kept the program from that recital folded neatly in a drawer as a reminder that even if no one saw me play, I had still played it all. It wasn't always sad, there were soft moments too. I loved listening to my father's stories about his own childhood, even if he rarely remembered to ask about mine. I cherished helping Olivia with her homework, braiding her hair while she chattered about her friends. There was a kind of closeness that came from being needed, even if it wasn't quite the same as being seen. I became the family helper, the one who kept secrets, who patched up torn dresses and broken hearts, who knew just how much sugar Mom liked in her tea and which books Ethan had hidden under his bed. If someone was crying in the next room, I was the first to notice, but rarely the first to be comforted. My place in the family was like a well-worn chair, steady useful, but never quite in the center of the photograph. Looking back, I realized that the roles we play as children are shaped by the things we don't say out loud. I never told anyone how much I longed to be picked first to have a birthday cake with my name written in icing to hear my parents brag about me the way they did for Ethan and Olivia. Instead, I clapped the loudest at their achievements, snapped the family photos, and made sure no one ever felt left out except maybe for me. The world teaches us early how to measure our worth in gold stars and report cards in the warmth of a parent's praise. When you don't receive those things, you learn to seek value elsewhere, to become the glue that holds everyone else together, even as you begin to wonder if you're actually needed at all. It's strange how easy it is to convince yourself that invisibility is just another word for humility. For years, I thought there was something noble about blending in, about being selfless, about never asking for more than I was given. If a neighbor dropped by, I was the one who offered tea. If a cousin needed a place to stay, I gave up my room without being asked. These gestures became my identity, the reliable one, the caretaker, the peacekeeper. Yet beneath the surface, I was quietly building up questions. What would happen if I stopped offering? Would anyone notice the empty space I left behind? Sometimes late at night, I'd imagine packing a suitcase and running away, not out of anger, but out of curiosity to see if the world would be any different with me gone. I remember one afternoon in 7th grade when our teacher asked everyone to write down their favorite thing about themselves. I stared at the blank paper, unsure how to answer. I had a list of things I did for others, but when it came to what I liked about myself, I drew a blank. At home that evening, I asked my mom, half joking, if you had to describe me in one word, what would it be? She looked up from her emails and said, "Dependable sweetheart, you're always there when we need you." She meant it as a compliment, and I tried to take it as one. But a tiny part of me wondered, was being there all I was meant to be? As I entered high school, the pattern continued. Ethan got a car for his graduation. Olivia's art was framed above the mantel. I worked a part-time job, got good grades, helped organize family events. Quiet successes that rarely made it into dinner conversation. If I had a problem, I solved it on my own. If I was hurt, I covered it up with a smile. People started to say things like, "Grace doesn't need much," or "she's easygoing, low maintenance." Those words stuck to me like a second skin. I didn't dare correct them, afraid that asking for more would somehow break the fragile peace I'd built. There's a lesson, I think, in how quickly we learn to silence our own needs when we believe those needs are inconvenient to others. Yet even in the shadows, there were sparks of hope. My grandmother, who visited every summer from Charleston, always seemed to see me differently. "You've got a gentle spirit, Gracie," she'd say, squeezing my hand as we sat on the porch together. That's rarer than people realize. She was the only one who called me Gracie. One year on my 12th birthday, she slipped a small silver locket into my palm. "This is for you when the time is right," she whispered. A reminder that you matter no matter what the world says. I clung to that locket, keeping it tucked away in a jewelry box, pulling it out on days when I felt especially small. In a way, it became my proof, a tiny token of the love I sometimes doubted but never quite lost. As the years went on, I found comfort in small rituals, reading on the porch swing at dusk, organizing my bookshelf by color baking muffins on Saturday mornings, when the house was still quiet. These moments were mine alone spaces where I didn't have to compete or prove anything to anyone. Sometimes I'd write letters to myself, words of encouragement, lists of things I was proud of, promises that I'd try to see my own worth even when no one else did. I didn't share these with anyone. They were my secret scaffolding holding me up in ways that applause and attention never could. If I learned anything from those early years, it's that invisibility can feel safe, even comforting, until it starts to feel like erasure. It's easy to fall into the habit of shrinking yourself, of making room for everyone else's needs, and then waking up one morning and realizing you've left no room for your own dreams. That's the lesson I want to share. Being gentle and giving is a beautiful thing, but not at the cost of your own voice. Love shouldn't require you to disappear. And so, as I grew into adulthood, I carried these invisible threads with me, each one woven from moments of kindness, loneliness, hope, and longing. I became skilled at reading a room, at anticipating what others needed before they could ask, at filling the silence so no one else would feel awkward. But deep down, I knew something was missing. I wanted more than to be dependable. I wanted to be seen, to be celebrated, to matter not just for what I could give, but for who I was. This is where my story truly begins, not with a grand betrayal or a sudden loss, but with the quiet realization that it was time to step out of the shadows. Because the truth is, no one else can claim your place in this world but you. And sometimes it takes losing yourself in the background to finally find the courage to walk into the light. Moving away for college, I carried a quiet sort of hope that distance might transform the way my family saw me. I imagined that maybe the ache of missing someone would remind them that I had always been there, a thread holding our tapestry together. Asheville became a postcard town behind me. My new world at university felt wide open, full of possibility. The first few weeks I called home every Sunday, sometimes reaching my mother, sometimes just the machine. "Love you, sweetheart. We're just running around today," her voice would say. Olivia, now in high school, rarely picked up. My father's updates were brief, punctuated by, "We're so proud of you," but the pride felt generic, the same words he used for Ethan's soccer trophies and Olivia's art ribbons. When I returned for Thanksgiving, I noticed a wall of family photos, fresh frames for Ethan's homecoming, Olivia's junior prom, but none of my college move-in, none from my scholarship award. I let myself believe they'd run out of space. At first, I tried harder to fill the gaps. I sent postcards from campus, brought home homemade cookies for holidays, and took on extra shifts at my campus job so I could buy thoughtful birthday gifts for everyone. I organized surprise video calls for Mom on Mother's Day, edited a photo slideshow for Dad's milestone birthday, and made sure to cheer the loudest when Olivia performed in her school play. Still my own achievements, a published essay in the college journal, a leadership award from the architecture club were met with polite nods or tucked away in polite conversation. "Oh, Gracie's always been good at school," Mom would say, as if it was expected, nothing worth a fuss. It hurt, but I told myself that being reliable meant not needing applause. One moment stands out with aching clarity. My sophomore year, the university held a parent recognition ceremony. Everyone's families came, fathers in suits, mothers with flowers, siblings snapping photos on their phones. I scanned the crowd searching for a familiar face, but my family didn't come. That evening, as I sat under a campus oak tree, my roommate Lily found me. "You're always the one cheering for everyone else," she said softly. "Who cheers for you?" I shrugged, unable to answer. That was the night I started understanding love in my family was often wrapped around conditions, being useful, being cheerful, not making waves. The warmth was always there, but it depended on me staying in my assigned role. The truth is, I made excuses for them. I told myself that busy lives and long drives justified their absence. I repeated lines like, "They show love in their own way, and some families just aren't sentimental." But beneath the logic, I felt the loneliness burrow deeper. I watched friends argue with their parents, then laugh over dinner the next night. Their bonds looked messy, loud, but real, full of visible affection and angry tears, not just smooth surfaces and gentle silences. Sometimes I even envied their drama. It meant someone cared enough to fight for space in each other's lives. My world was quiet or polished, but I was learning that perfection often hid 100 untold disappointments. I wondered if my family saw me as self-sufficient, someone who didn't need to be celebrated, who was fine with being overlooked. Maybe by not asking for more, I had trained them to give me less. But there's a difference between not needing help and not deserving love. I see now that I mistook my own coping mechanisms for strength. There's a strange pride in being the easy child, the one who never causes trouble, but it's a pride that comes at a cost. Over time, you lose track of where you end and where other people's expectations begin. In small ways, the pattern repeated itself. If I offered to drive Olivia to practice, she'd accept with the distracted thanks eyes on her phone. When Ethan broke up with his girlfriend, I listened late into the night as he poured out his grief, only for him to forget my own heartbreaks months later. I became the family's trusted keeper, collecting everyone's secrets, but sharing few of my own. It's not that they were cruel. It's just that I was easy to overlook a comfort that blended into the background. The lesson was subtle, but powerful to be loved. I must remain useful, agreeable, small. I remember one Christmas when I saved for weeks to buy Mom a cashmere scarf. She opened it with a smile, saying, "Oh, honey, you shouldn't have." The next day, I noticed the tag still on, tucked into a drawer, with other well-meaning gifts. That year, Ethan's new watch and Olivia's digital camera were paraded proudly to every neighbor who visited. I told myself it didn't matter. But small moments missed over and over eventually gather weight. I began to realize that love, when doled out on a scorecard, never truly satisfies anyone, not the giver or the receiver. If I could offer one lesson from these years, it would be this: conditional love is a slow erosion, not a sudden earthquake. It wears you down quietly, convincing you that crumbs are a feast, that being fine is the same as being fulfilled. But real love doesn't ask you to shrink to become less of yourself for someone else's comfort. It took me years to understand that, years of wishing I could just be grateful for whatever scraps I was given. The truth is, wanting to be celebrated, to be chosen, to be truly seen, it's not selfish, it's human. Still, I clung to hope. Each time my family missed a milestone, I'd promise myself that the next time would be different. I would plan ahead, send reminders, offer to help make it easy for them. I was always preparing for the love I hoped would finally come. In this way, I lived with both disappointment and expectation, never fully giving up on my place at the family table. The longing never went away, but neither did the belief that I could someday earn their attention, if only I found the right way to prove my worth. That hope kept me moving forward, and sometimes it even paid off in small ways: a forgotten birthday remembered with a late-night phone call, a card in the mail weeks after the fact. But more often it meant letting myself down, gently learning to patch up the holes left by other people's absence. I became skilled at making the best of things, at pretending the scraps were enough, at building joy in the moments that belonged to me alone. And so I held on, sometimes out of love, sometimes out of habit. It wasn't until the promise of something special, a long-awaited sign that maybe my family finally saw me, that everything I'd tried to ignore finally came into focus. Some memories stay bright even when the rest of the past begins to blur at the edges. For me, one of those memories is my 18th birthday, the first time I felt like my story might hold a secret meaning, a promise that things could be different. That year, I wasn't expecting much. My parents were busy with work, Ethan was getting ready for college, and Olivia had just started a new dance team. Birthdays in our house had always been low-key. I had stopped hoping for parties with streamers or a table crowded with gifts. Instead, I spent the morning quietly reading, baking myself a small cake, letting the day slip by with no expectation at all. But that afternoon, my grandmother arrived early, a swirl of floral perfume and gentle laughter filling our kitchen. She brought with her a small box, wrapped not in shiny paper, but in a faded handkerchief, one I remembered seeing in her dresser when I was a little girl. "Grace, come here, honey," she said, her voice soft but steady. I sat beside her at the kitchen table as she placed the box in my hands. "Every woman in our family has a story," she whispered, "and every story needs a keepsake." Inside was a vintage gold watch, delicate with a thin chain and an inscription too faded to read. When you're truly ready, when you know your own worth, this will be yours, she said. It's more than a watch. It's a reminder that time and value are both yours to claim. I can't describe the feeling that washed over me as she spoke, half pride, half disbelief. For the first time, I saw myself as part of something bigger than the daily routines of our family, more than the roles I played or the chores I finished. My grandmother's eyes shone with the kind of love that needed no proof, and I tucked her words away like a seed in winter soil. I wore the watch for a few moments, feeling the cool metal against my skin, before she tucked it back in the handkerchief and pressed it into my palm. One day you'll know when it's time, she said again, and I believed her. It wasn't about earning or deserving. It was about belonging simply because I was me. Over the years, that promise became a silent companion, especially during moments when I felt invisible or unimportant. When my parents forgot a milestone, or when Olivia's victories crowded out my quiet progress, I'd take out the watch and let its weight settle in my hand. It was never about the thing itself. It was about the story that came with it. The watch stood for everything I hoped to become: someone who valued herself, who understood her own worth, who didn't need the world's applause to know she mattered. I started writing little notes to myself, tucking them in a box under my bed, reminders that I was growing into my own life, even if no one else was watching. It's easy, I think, to downplay the importance of small gestures or private promises. But sometimes they're all we have. The world is full of people whose dreams were handed to them in broad daylight, cheered on at graduations, hugged after every accomplishment. For others, hope comes quietly, a whispered encouragement in a crowded room, a meaningful gift given on a rainy afternoon. My grandmother gave me more than a watch. She gave me permission to see myself as valuable, even if no one else did. That kind of belief is a powerful seed. It takes root slowly, but once planted, it's hard to uproot. Looking back, I see now how that promise changed the way I moved through the world. I began to look for small signs of my own growth, tiny victories like speaking up in class or making a new friend that showed me I was more than a supporting character in someone else's life. I started volunteering at a local community center, teaching art classes to kids who reminded me of myself. Watching them light up as they painted, I realized how much I needed someone to look at me that way, to really see me, to encourage my boldest colors. So I tried to be that person for them, giving what I wished someone had given me. Of course, there were still setbacks, still moments when the watch felt too heavy to hold, when family gatherings made me feel smaller than ever. There were holidays where the promise of being ready felt like another expectation I couldn't meet, and days when my faith in myself flickered. But the difference was now I had something to hold on to, both literally and figuratively. The watch became a symbol of patience, a reminder that I was growing into myself at my own pace, not on anyone else's timeline. It taught me to wait not for someone else to validate my journey, but for the moment when I could recognize my own worth. If there's a lesson in all this, it's that hope, no matter how quietly given, can sustain you in the hardest times. You don't always get to choose the love you receive, but you can choose the promises you make to yourself. Sometimes, the smallest seed of encouragement is enough to carry you forward, to help you weather the years when nothing seems to change. My grandmother's gift wasn't just a keepsake. It was a roadmap, a gentle push toward a future where I would finally trust myself to step out of the shadows. As my 20s unfolded, that promise shaped my choices. I looked for friendships that were nourishing, for work that made me feel seen. I tried to build a life where I wasn't just dependable, but also celebrated, at least in small ways. If not by my family, then by the people I chose to call my own. I kept the watch safe, waiting for the day when I'd feel truly ready to wear it, not because I'd earned it, but because I finally understood I didn't have to. And that's why, when a new birthday approached, a milestone marked by the same familiar quiet, but this time with a mysterious promise from my mother, I felt a strange surge of hope. Maybe things were finally changing. Maybe my family had started to see me. Maybe, just maybe, it was time for the seed my grandmother planted to finally bloom. There's a peculiar hope that grows in the silence before a promise is fulfilled, a hope that whispers, "This time, maybe things will be different." As my 30th birthday approached, I let that hope take root, even against my better judgment. Days before my mother called out of the blue, her tone lighter than usual, almost conspiratorial. "Grace, keep your Saturday open, okay? We're planning something special." I could hear the clatter of dishes in the background, Olivia's laughter echoing from another room. It was the first time in years that anyone in my family had asked me to save the date for something that was just for me. The words "something special" fluttered around my heart like a secret fragile and bright. The days that followed were painted with nervous anticipation. I canceled my own quiet birthday plans, a dinner with friends, an afternoon at the art museum, just in case my family truly meant to celebrate me this time. I went out and bought a new blouse, spent the evening before tidying my apartment and baking my favorite lemon loaf, imagining I'd have someone to share it with. I checked my phone obsessively, rereading the short text from my mother, analyzing every word, searching for signs of real excitement. Even Olivia, who so often forgot my milestones, sent me a rare emoji-laden message. "Don't book anything Saturday, trust us. Hope once planted grows wild, even when you know better." On the morning of my birthday, I woke early, unable to sleep for the promise of something meaningful. I made coffee, set out 2 cups, and watched the sunlight move across the kitchen table. I let myself believe, just for a few hours, that this year would be different. The phone stayed quiet, but I told myself they were busy, maybe driving, maybe decorating, maybe planning a surprise worthy of a big birthday. By noon, my excitement had faded to a low buzz. I refreshed my messages, checked for missed calls, and convinced myself that the celebration would happen later in the evening, after everyone finished their errands. As the afternoon stretched on my nerves, twisted into something sharper, I tried to distract myself watering plants, reading half a chapter of a novel, reorganizing the spice rack, but nothing could quite shake the feeling of waiting. At 3, I texted my mom a gentle "let me know if you need help setting up." There was no reply. I checked Olivia's social media, half expecting to see a cryptic post hinting at a secret gathering. But her feed was silent, save for a throwback photo from her latest dance recital. My heart thudded in my chest, heavy with old fears. What if they forgot again? What if I'd built a castle of hope out of sand? By evening, the truth began to settle in. The phone didn't ring. No one knocked on my door. I watched the sun slip behind the trees and realized, in the way you do, when disappointment is an old friend, that nothing was coming. My apartment, so carefully prepared for guests, stayed silent. I lit a single candle, cut a small piece of lemon loaf, and tried to convince myself I was okay. I sent a message to my closest friend, Anna. "Looks like it's just me tonight. Want to split some cake over Zoom?" She called immediately, her voice full of warmth and frustration on my behalf. "You deserve more than this," she said. "But I'm here." And in that moment, I remembered that chosen family sometimes shows up in ways the ones we're born into never will. What makes disappointment so cutting is not always the absence of celebration, but the echo of all the years you spent hoping things would change. Every birthday that passed without a call, every milestone that went unmarked, became a shadow at the edge of this one. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there'd been a misunderstanding, maybe someone was sick, maybe there was still time for them to remember. But deep down, I knew this pattern. The truth is, it's easier to blame yourself for being forgotten than to accept that people you love might never see you the way you long to be seen. That night, I looked at the gold watch from my grandmother, its face glinting in the soft light. I thought about all the promises we keep tucked away for years, hoping they'll one day be honored by someone else. Sometimes, though, the only promise you can trust is the one you make to yourself, that you'll keep going, even when no one else shows up. I wrote a letter in my journal, a quiet vow to remember this feeling, not to use it as a weapon, but as a lantern to light my path forward. I promised myself that next year, no matter what, I'd celebrate myself, even if I was the only one at the table. If there's a lesson here, it's that disappointment, though painful, can be clarifying. It reveals the places where you've been waiting too long, the people you've excused for too many years. It teaches you that hope is not a weakness, but a measure of your courage, a sign that despite everything you're still willing to believe in love. But it also reminds you that sometimes you have to stop waiting for someone else to see your worth and start honoring it yourself. As midnight approached, I blew out the candle on my small slice of cake and let the silence settle around me, not as a punishment, but as a space to breathe. The next morning, I opened the curtains to a new day, determined to move forward with a little less expectation and a little more resolve. Because sometimes the greatest gift is not the party you waited for, but the quiet strength you find in letting go. What I didn't know then was that this disappointment would become a turning point, the moment when the old hope made room for a new kind of promise. And as the days unfolded, a different truth began to reveal itself, one that would test everything I thought I knew about my place in the family. Sometimes the sharpest truths reveal themselves not in a burst of drama, but in the quiet flicker of a screen, a photo, or a casual sentence you weren't meant to read. A few days after my birthday, I was scrolling through social media, an old habit mostly to distract myself from lingering disappointment. I didn't expect much. My feeds were filled with the usual work updates from friends, family dogs, and funny hats, photos of meals and sunsets. And then without warning, Olivia's post appeared. It was a group shot my family gathered around a table at the lake house, smiles, wide plates piled high, a homemade banner strung behind them. Ethan raised a glass. Mom laughed, leaning into the light. Olivia's caption read, "Best night ever. So grateful for everyone who showed up to celebrate us." I stared at the image, blinking as if it might shift. There was no sign of me, not even a mention in the comments. It wasn't just my absence that stung. It was how complete they all looked without me. For a moment, I wondered if I had missed an invitation, if there'd been a last-minute change. But the longer I studied their faces, the clearer it became the celebration had never been meant for me. My special day was a family gathering for someone else, a quiet engagement for Ethan, a milestone for Olivia, maybe just an excuse to be together. My name, my milestone, had become background noise to their real festivities. All the hope I'd held on to unraveled in an instant. I felt foolish for believing that this year might be different, for setting a table no one would sit at, for choosing my outfit, and keeping my schedule clear. I realized in a way that was both sudden and slow that I had been hoping for people to see me who had long ago learned to look right past me. There's a unique ache to realizing you are invisible by design, not accident. It's one thing to be forgotten, it's another to be deliberately left out. I replayed old conversations, Mom's gentle, "We're planning something," Olivia's cheerful, "Trust us," and heard the edges of evasion in their words. I remembered childhood games where I waited to be picked, teen years spent working behind the scenes while everyone else took center stage. It wasn't that my family hated me. It was simply that they had grown so used to my presence, my quiet caretaking, my reliable support, that my absence was easier to ignore than confront. I had become the glue, the background, the steady hum that allowed everyone else to shine. It hurt, but there was clarity in the hurt. For years, I had told myself stories to protect my heart. Maybe they just forgot. Maybe next time, maybe I wasn't making enough effort. But the truth was clearer now. I had been waiting for people to notice me who had no reason to start. Their lives were full, their celebrations complete. I wasn't a villain in their story, but I wasn't a hero either. I was simply a side note, a comfort, a convenience. That realization was both freeing and devastating. I spent the rest of that evening letting the truth settle. At first, anger bubbled up sharp and defensive. I wanted to call, to demand an explanation, to point out the glaring absence. But the urge faded quickly. There was no drama here, only an old pattern playing out once more. Instead, I found myself grieving not just the missed birthday, but all the years spent waiting for an invitation that was never coming. I looked at photos on my phone, scrolling through memories of holidays, reunions, and family trips. In every group shot, I was there, just off-center, smiling politely, making space for someone else's story. The unspoken message echoed, "We're fine as we are. Don't ask for more." One lesson I learned in that moment is this: sometimes the most painful truths are also the most liberating. When you stop hoping to fit into spaces that never welcomed you, you make room for new belonging. It's not about giving up on family, but about giving up on the need for their approval. That evening, I wrote in my journal, "I cannot make people see me who choose not to look." The words felt both sad and strong, a private declaration of independence. Of course, that clarity didn't erase the longing. I still wished deep down for a sign, a text, a phone call, a moment of recognition. But I also began to notice the weight that lifted when I let go of that hope. I thought about my grandmother's watch and how she'd promised it would be mine when you know your own worth. Maybe after all this time she wasn't waiting for me to be noticed by others, but for me to notice myself. Realizing the truth of my family's dynamic didn't happen in a single night. It unfolded over the next days as I quietly tested the boundaries of my own patience and self-respect. I stopped checking for new messages, stopped rehearsing explanations for my hurt. I sat with the ache until it dulled and found comfort in the company of friends who noticed when I was quiet, who asked how I was really doing, who invited me just because they wanted me there. There is a different kind of love in those gestures, a healing one. If there is a lesson to carry from this, it's that visibility is not a reward to be earned from those who take you for granted. It is a right, and sometimes you have to claim it for yourself by stepping back, by saying no, by letting go of rituals that only reinforce your invisibility. That's when a new kind of strength begins to grow, the strength to build a life where you are celebrated, not just useful. Looking back, I see that moment for what it was, not the end of hope, but the start of seeing things as they are not, as I wish they could be. It was the beginning of a quiet revolution in my heart, one that would lead me step by gentle step toward honoring my own story. If realizing you are invisible is a slow ache, then seeing your hopes handed to someone else is a sharp and sudden pain, one you feel in your chest and your hands at the same time. A few days after that birthday revelation, I saw another photo in the family group chat. This one caught my breath completely off guard. Olivia beaming in a sunlit living room, showing off a gold watch on her wrist. My grandmother's watch. The one I had held on to as a promise, a secret source of comfort through all those years of waiting. Under the photo, Mom had written, "A keepsake for our shining star. May it always remind you of how loved you are." My heart twisted. I recognized the inscription, the thin chain, every faded scratch on the face. Olivia didn't even tag me or mention me in the caption. It was as if the story of that watch, the story of us, had been rewritten without me. In that moment, I flashed back to the promise my grandmother made, the softness in her voice as she pressed the watch into my palm. This is for you, when you know your worth. It wasn't about the object itself, but about being chosen, remembered, cherished in a way that felt unshakable. I had never worn it, not really. I'd kept it safe, letting the promise settle deep inside, believing one day I would know that I belonged, know that I could claim my own place in the story. Now that hope was gone. I didn't blame Olivia for accepting the gift. She had always moved easily through the world, never questioning whether she was loved. But I felt betrayed not just by my mother's decision, but by the quiet rewriting of family memory, the way my own claim was erased with a single gesture. It's strange how grief for something small can stir up bigger, older wounds. I remembered asking my mother about the watch years before, after my grandmother's funeral. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm keeping it safe. When the time is right, we'll decide together," she'd said, her voice distracted as she folded laundry. I wanted to believe her. I held on to the hope that the right moment would come. Now I saw it for what it was, a way to postpone, to avoid, to let time do the difficult work of forgetting. The watch hadn't just been passed on. The meaning behind it had been handed to someone else, as if the history we shared could be replaced by convenience. This wasn't about jealousy or material things. I could have bought 100 gold watches, but only one held that specific history, that blessing, that whispered promise. What hurt most was the ease with which my place in the family story was given away, without acknowledgement or explanation. I wondered if my mother even remembered what the watch had meant to me, or if she saw it as just another trinket to distribute. Sometimes, when you are the dependable one, people forget you have attachments too, that the things you treasure are not just for safekeeping, but for belonging. In the days that followed, I found myself revisiting old memories, searching for moments that might have signaled this outcome. Had I not spoken up enough? Was I too patient, too accepting, too silent about what I needed? I thought about all the birthdays, the missed milestones, the years of showing up with open hands. I wondered how many times I had told myself, "It's okay, they'll see me eventually." and how often that hope had kept me in a story where I was only ever an extra. It's easy in the aftermath of disappointment to rewrite the past in sharper contrast to see all the signs you ignored because you so badly wanted things to be different. But there's a lesson buried inside this kind of betrayal, one that took me a long time to understand. When you pin your sense of worth to someone else's recognition, you give away your power. Keepsakes are beautiful, but they cannot replace the deeper work of learning to honor your own story. My grandmother's gift was meant as a reminder, not as a substitute for love. If I let its loss define me, I would be trading one kind of invisibility for another. The real promise, I realized, was never about the watch. It was about choosing day after day to remember my own worth, even if no one else did. Of course, these realizations don't erase the sting overnight. I grieved the loss in small, private ways, pulling out the faded handkerchief my grandmother once used, reading the old letters she wrote, letting myself feel the hurt rather than rushing past it. I talked to Anna, my friend, who listened quietly, and reminded me that sometimes families give what they can, not what we hope for. She shared her own story, an heirloom lost to a cousin, the pain of being overlooked, the long road to forgiveness. Her words didn't fix anything, but they made me feel less alone. In time, I began to look at the keepsake in a different way. I realized that no one could steal the memories I carried, the lessons I learned, the quiet strength I'd built over the years. The watch was a symbol, yes, but I was the living proof of my grandmother's legacy. I chose to believe that she would have wanted me to move forward, not to let a single act define the entirety of our bond. With this new clarity, I resolved to hold tighter to the parts of my story that no one else could rewrite: my resilience, my compassion, my ability to begin again. And so another chapter closed, but a new determination began to grow in its place. If I could not reclaim my place in the old story, perhaps it was time to start writing a new one where keepsakes are honored but not required, and where worth is measured by the love you give yourself. There comes a moment in every quiet person's life when silence shifts from being a shield to feeling like a prison. After seeing my grandmother's watch on Olivia's wrist, I drifted through the next week in a fog, each day tinged with a peculiar mix of numbness and clarity. I avoided the family group chat, skipped the calls from home, and even found myself putting my phone on silent, something I'd never done before. It wasn't anger that kept me away. It was exhaustion, a bone-deep tiredness from years of explaining, justifying, and quietly forgiving what I was supposed to simply accept. The truth was, I was tired of asking for crumbs when I deserved a seat at the table. Family for so many is supposed to be an anchor, a place where love is unconditional and forgiveness is infinite. But what happens when those conditions feel more like a contract, one you never signed but are expected to uphold? I replayed conversations in my head, remembering every time I'd tried to share my disappointment and been met with defensiveness or dismissal. "Don't be so sensitive," Grace Mom would say, or, "You know how busy we are." My needs were always too much, too complicated, too easy to set aside. That pattern, I realized, wasn't going to change just because I kept hoping it would. The more I pulled back, the more my absence seemed to ripple. Ethan texted once a quick, "Everything okay?" that I ignored. Olivia sent a selfie with the caption, "Miss you," but didn't mention the watch or my birthday. Even my mother, who rarely wrote more than a sentence at a time, started sending long messages about family, about how no one's perfect, and we all make mistakes. But nowhere in her words was there an apology, an acknowledgement of hurt, or even a question about what I needed. Their words were meant to soothe, but they only deepened my sense of invisibility. It's strange how loneliness can feel sharper in a crowd, even a virtual one. One evening after another day spent dodging their messages, I sat down at my kitchen table and stared at the phone. I thought about all the ways I could respond with honesty, with anger, with a desperate plea to be seen. But every draft felt small and unsatisfying. It occurred to me that I was caught in an old trap, believing that if I just explained myself better, if I found the right words, things would finally change. In reality, no explanation was ever enough. My family's comfort depended on my compliance, on me staying quiet and grateful. I realized that for once, silence wasn't avoidance, it was a boundary. The next morning, I did something I'd never dared before. I left the family group chat without a word. There was no dramatic goodbye, no final statement, just a quiet click, and then nothing. It felt both terrifying and exhilarating, like stepping off a familiar path and into unknown woods. My phone buzzed for hours with texts and missed calls, but I didn't answer. Instead, I went for a long walk in the park, letting the chill autumn air fill my lungs. For the first time, I felt my body relax as if releasing a weight I'd carried for years. Choosing silence was not a punishment for my family, but a gift to myself, a way to create space for my own healing. That weekend, Anna came over with pastries and a bottle of wine. We sat on my floor surrounded by half-finished art projects and old photo albums. I told her everything: the watch, the birthday, the years of waiting for things to change. Anna listened without interruption, then squeezed my hand. "You don't have to keep asking for what you already deserve," she said. "It's okay to step back." Her words felt like permission, and I let myself cry, not out of bitterness, but out of relief. If there's a lesson here, it's that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to choose silence over begging. Not every story of family hurt ends with reconciliation or a grand apology. Sometimes the only path forward is the one where you honor your pain, even if it means walking alone for a while. In our culture, we're taught that keeping peace is the highest virtue, that forgiveness must come at all costs. But peace that costs your self-respect isn't peace at all. Boundaries aren't walls. They're doors you close so you can rest, heal, and decide who is safe to let in. The days that followed were surprisingly calm. Without the constant ping of my family's messages, I began to notice other sounds: the quiet hum of the city outside my window, the comfort of Anna's laughter, the music I played just for myself. I realized how much energy I'd spent trying to earn a love that should have been given freely. With every hour of silence, I felt stronger, more whole. The urge to reach out to explain or fix faded. I knew that if my family ever truly wanted to understand, the invitation was there, but I was done begging. As autumn gave way to winter, I started to see possibility where there had once been only longing. My story wasn't over. It was changing shape, making room for a new kind of belonging. I began to dream about what healing could look like on my own terms, about building a life where being seen wasn't a battle but a given. There's a strange quiet that follows the breaking of old patterns, a kind of hush that at first feels like loneliness, but with time begins to sound a lot more like freedom. The weeks after stepping away from my family's orbit were not easy. My routines changed. I had to remind myself that it was okay not to check my phone every few minutes, not to invent reasons to reach out. In that open space, painful questions echoed: who am I when I'm not the reliable one? What do I want if I'm not living for someone else's approval? These were questions I'd postponed for years, but now with the silence as my companion, I couldn't ignore them any longer. At first, the emptiness felt raw. I missed the small rituals that came with family Sunday calls and side jokes, even the irritation of familiar complaints. There's a comfort in belonging, even to a place that never fully sees you. But gradually, I realized that longing for those patterns was just a habit, not a sign that I'd made a mistake. I began to fill my days with things that had nothing to do with being useful to others: long walks through the neighborhood, cooking new recipes just for myself, picking up my sketchbook again, and drawing simply because it brought me joy. Each act, though small, was a quiet rebellion against the years I'd spent making myself small. One of the hardest parts of healing was learning to let go of guilt. For a while, every moment of happiness felt tinged with doubt. Was it selfish to enjoy life when my family might still be hurting or confused by my absence? Anna, always a gentle presence, reminded me that boundaries are not punishments. They're invitations to honor what is healthy, fair, and true. You can love people and still need distance, she'd say, and every time I heard it, I believed a little more. I started seeing a therapist, something I'd resisted for years. In those weekly sessions, I learned to name my feelings without apology, to see the patterns I'd outgrown, and to imagine new ways of living. A turning point came one evening as I sat in a small cafe watching the world bustle past rain-streaked windows. I was alone, but for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel lonely. I pulled out my journal and wrote down the names of people who made me feel valued: Anna, my colleague Sam, even a neighbor who always greeted me with a smile. I realized that family could be something you build, not just something you inherit. I started reaching out to friends, more inviting them for coffee, sharing parts of my story I had once kept hidden. With each honest conversation, the ache of isolation softened, replaced by a sense of belonging on my own terms. Another lesson came from watching the children at the community art center where I volunteered. Their delight in creation, unfiltered and fearless, reminded me of the girl I once was before the world taught me to measure my worth by other people's reactions. I started to reclaim old dreams, signing up for a pottery class and letting myself be a beginner again. Messy hands, crooked bowls, laughter with strangers, all of it was healing in ways I hadn't expected. When I finished my first piece, Anna celebrated with me as if I'd won a prize. In that moment, I understood it's not the scale of the victory that matters, but the willingness to celebrate yourself at all. Slowly, I began to forgive not just my family for their blindness, but myself for staying so long in a story that didn't fit. I wrote letters I never sent, letting my anger and grief pour out without censoring the truth. I let myself remember the good things, too. The kindnesses my family did offer, the moments that had warmth, even if they weren't perfect. Forgiveness didn't mean excusing their actions or inviting them back into my heart without question. It meant letting go of the belief that my worth depended on their love. That freedom felt fragile at first, but with each day, it grew stronger. If there's a lesson to be gathered from this part of the journey, it's this: self-worth is something you nurture, not something you beg for. It grows in the quiet acts of self-respect, in saying no when it hurts, in saying yes to joy, in allowing yourself to start again. Healing isn't a straight line. Some days I missed my family fiercely, other days I felt fierce in my independence. Both truths could coexist, and that realization was its own kind of grace. With time, I noticed I was no longer waiting for a message that never came. I stopped needing closure, stopped checking their profiles, stopped replaying old conversations in my mind. I trusted that if reconciliation ever came, it would be on new terms once, where I would no longer bargain away my dignity. Instead, I put my energy into nurturing the community that saw me as I was, not as I was supposed to be. In giving myself permission to heal, I learned to honor every scar as proof of how far I'd come. And so, as winter thawed and spring crept back into the world, I felt the stirrings of a new possibility. If I could build a life rooted in self-worth, perhaps I could find the courage to let go of old keepsakes, both physical and emotional, and return them to the past where they belonged. Letting go rarely arrives in a grand gesture. More often it comes quietly after the ache has softened, and you've grown strong enough to imagine life without the weight you once carried. By early spring, as sunlight warmed the sidewalks and the world started to bloom again, I felt something shifting inside me. The gold watch, the keepsake I'd once guarded as a symbol of belonging, had become less a promise and more a memory. Its absence from my drawer no longer stung as sharply. Instead, I found myself thinking about what it meant to hold on and what it could mean to let go. One afternoon, I stood at my window and watched as children played on the stoop across the street, their laughter rising and falling in the breeze. I remembered how for so many years I'd clung to the hope that my family would see me, celebrate me, welcome me back into a story that was never fully mine. But with every new friendship, every act of self-care, I was learning to measure my worth differently. The watch, once my anchor, felt out of place in my new life. I knew then that letting it go wasn't surrender. It was a quiet reclamation of who I had become. The decision was simple, though not easy. I wrapped the watch in the faded handkerchief my grandmother had used, adding a note with just 2 words: "With love." I placed it in a small box and mailed it to Olivia. There was no need for explanation or apology. I understood now that returning the keepsake wasn't an act of defeat or forgiveness. It was a choice to step fully into my own story, unburdened by old claims or unspoken expectations. When Olivia's message arrived, "Thank you, Grace. It's beautiful," I felt only relief. The watch would be part of her journey now, and I could honor my memories without needing to possess the symbol. Letting go, I discovered, is less about erasing the past and more about clearing space for what comes next. In the weeks after mailing the keepsake, I noticed a lightness in my daily routines. I spent more time with friends, tried new things, and allowed myself moments of joy without the old shadow of comparison. I planted a small herb garden on my windowsill, each sprout a quiet reminder that growth doesn't depend on anyone else's permission. I laughed more, dreamed bigger, and stopped measuring my happiness against a family narrative that never fit. The act of releasing the keepsake became a turning point in how I saw myself. No longer did I need tokens to prove my value or memories to validate my journey. I realized that the love my grandmother gave me, the wisdom in her eyes, the stories we shared, had already shaped who I was. Her legacy lived on in my kindness, my resilience, and my willingness to begin again, not in a gold watch or any other object. I learned that true inheritance is carried in character, not in things. One evening, I told Anna about the decision. She smiled, understanding, before I even finished. "That's real freedom, Grace," she said. "You're choosing to remember, not to hold." We toasted with tea and chipped mugs, two friends celebrating the gentle work of growing up. I thought of all the times I'd been afraid to let go and how each time I did something better grew in the space I'd cleared. That night, as I climbed into bed, I felt peaceful, not because the past was fixed, but because it no longer controlled me. There's a lesson in this one I wish I'd learned sooner. Sometimes what we're most afraid to release is exactly what we need to set free to discover our next chapter. Keepsakes can comfort us, but they can also tether us to stories that no longer serve. Letting go is not about forgetting, but about honoring the truth of your own becoming. When you return what was never really yours, to keep you make room for belonging that is real and chosen, not forced or inherited. With the weight of the keepsake gone, I started to see my future as wide open, no longer defined by what I'd lost or given away. I looked at old photos less often and started capturing new ones, snapshots of hikes with friends' pottery glazed in cheerful colors, mornings spent journaling on my porch. I felt proud not of the objects I owned or the roles I'd played, but of the woman I was finally becoming. I was learning to trust that worth is an inside job, built day by day in honesty, courage, and hope. And so as spring turned toward summer, I stood on the threshold of something new. My story was not the one I'd hoped for as a child, but it was richer than I'd ever expected. I had learned to honor the past without letting it define me, to forgive without forgetting, and to love without needing to be chosen in return. Most of all, I had discovered that sometimes the greatest act of love for others and for yourself is the simple, powerful decision to let go. It was with that same spirit of renewal that I began to dream about how to celebrate the journey ahead on my own terms, with my own traditions. There's a gentle kind of power in choosing to start again. In the quiet, after so many years of waiting to be seen, I found the courage to become the author of my own story. It didn't happen all at once, and it didn't erase the ache of old disappointments. But each day I stitched together new rituals, simple breakfasts in the sunlight, phone calls with friends who listened, evenings spent crafting art just for the joy of it. The emptiness left by lost traditions and keepsakes was gradually filled by the life I built for myself piece by piece out of the small acts of honoring who I truly was. Looking back, I can see the thread running through it all. Childhood shaped me with its silences and missed moments. The ache of conditional love taught me that yearning alone would never buy belonging. My grandmother's promise planted hope, a hope that I carried through disappointments through the day. I saw my place in the family for what it was, through the heartbreak of losing not just a keepsake, but the story I thought it told. It took time and no small amount of grief to reach the breaking point where silence became my first true boundary, where stepping away was no longer a defeat, but an act of self-respect. The healing journey wasn't linear. I made mistakes, took steps forward and back. But in choosing friends who saw me, in allowing myself new beginnings, and in returning what I once held so tightly, I found a freedom I'd only imagined. I learned that letting go does not mean erasing the past. It means carrying its lessons with me and refusing to let old wounds write my future. In this way, I learned to forgive without forgetting to celebrate small joys, without needing anyone else's permission, and to become the family I wished I'd had first for myself and then for others. If there's one message I hope you carry from my story, it's this: you are not defined by the roles you were given, nor by the people who failed to see your worth. The love you offer yourself is the foundation for every other kind of belonging. Sometimes starting over is the bravest thing you'll ever do. Sometimes letting go is the only way to make space for the life that truly fits. And in every ending, there's the seed of a new beginning, one only you can write. So if you've ever felt invisible or left behind or like a supporting character in your own life, know that you are not alone. Your story matters, and it's never too late to reclaim it. Share your thoughts in the comments or tell me about your own journey. I read every word. If this story touched you, please like and subscribe to join our community of people finding courage, hope, and healing together. Every voice here helps someone else feel a little less alone. Thank you for listening, for believing, and for reminding me that every quiet story deserves to be told. Until next time, take gentle care of yourself and keep writing your own ending.